Laurie Arp and Megan Forbes are at LYRASIS. They are a tag team of our next speakers. They are both at LYRASIS and are going to be talking about um, a model for collaboration and sustainability. Actually, it's kind of interesting. The It Takes a Village model is something that I, as a new member of the board of directors at Force 11, we're actually exploring and implementing, going through an exercise to take this model through. So I'm interested to hear more about it and how it works before I implement it at Force. So, Laurie, Megan, over to you.
Remember to unmute myself. Hopefully you can see the screen okay. Todd, if you nod, I will
Yes.
know that you can. Excellent. So welcome. We're very happy to be talking with you all today. We're going to be talking about ITAV, It Takes a Village, open source software models of collaboration and sustainability. I'm going to be tag teaming with Megan. I'm the director of DuraSpace Community Supported Software at LYRASIS, and Megan is the amazing program manager for Collection Space. We're going to talk a little bit in our time about overall goals that we've had, the core findings, what we call the sustainability phases and facets, the resulting ITAV guidebook, and then kind of what we're doing since the first phase. Now we're in the second phase, talking about ITAV in practice. So there's a large and growing body of open source software supporting cultural and heritage organizations. And as you're all aware, some of these programs have done amazing jobs creating robust products with widespread adoption and engaged communities. And others have really struggled to find how to proceed once a grant ends or when there's costly upgrades. And so when we originally proposed this project to IMLS, there really wasn't a good method out there for communities and programs to share sustainability information and strategies. It became clear as we started working together, they all felt they were the only ones struggling with this. So our goals in that initial project were really bringing together open source programs to help share shared sustainability strategies and providing our communities with the information needed to assess and contribute to the sustainability of these programs that we rely on. So the core findings, which haven't really changed since 2018, one is that sustainable programs grow from community needs. And I know that might sound kind of like, well, right, but you'd be surprised how often people fall in love with a technology solution or an idea and run with it and then try to find the community. And if I had to give one word of advice for sustainability, it's really making sure you're finding a need that meets a community's needs, and that community will sustain that organization and that program much longer. Also, we found, and again, this seems obvious in retrospect, the sustainability is not one thing nor a straight line. One of the elements, we did a bunch of elements to this first phase, including a survey and a national forum. And I think Megan and I really expected when we were combing through all the data to find some outliers of like all the successful programs share these qualities, like they have so many shared paid staff, or they've been around a certain amount of time, or they have a certain number of core contributors. And there really wasn't. The sustainable programs, the successful ones, all had very different things coming in line for them. So it's not one thing, and it's not a straight line. Sustainability has phases and facets that move together and separately, and I'll talk a little more about those. So the facets are the elements. There's lots of things that contribute to sustainability. These are the four that kind of coalesced the most. When I first bring up the word sustainability, lots of times the first thing that comes to mind is money. Money's important. People need money, lots of resources, but it's not the only thing. And when I think sometimes people focus on the financial elements, they're missing out on all these other opportunities. So by focusing on four facets instead of just one, it brings a more holistic view. I'm going to mention these briefly, and then Megan will get into more detail. First is governance. This is really establishing roles and processes. And in my head, I think of it as how decisions get made. The second is technology, the software development and challenges that impact the development process. Obviously, open source is not completely different than proprietary software development, but there are their own challenges given the community. Resources are human and financial resources in the variety of forms. Staff, volunteers, money to pay, contracted development, all those are resources. And then community engagement is really around those efforts to foster a community and involvement with the community. It's at its root turning users into stakeholders that care and want the program to succeed. The other element is phases. Trying to divide up all where programs are really helps if you think about 3 different phases. Just about all the time, people are at the beginning just getting started. They're in the really early stages of planning, development, and design, frequently grant funded. Phase 2 is the growing phase, and this is the broadest. This can take a long time, and I sometimes like to think of it as the danger zone. This is where you really need to take the original idea and incipient community and really make sure you're fostering it into a sustainable community. The third phase is stable but not static. This is where you're thinking like, hey, this is working. We have some stable revenue sources, we have an engaged community, we have technology that's stable. But this is where you really need to beware of complacency. Whatever those original community needs were that you started to address, those might change over time. So you really need to think about, are we still the best way to serve those needs? Are there other programs that are more engaged with the community or serving those needs? Do we need to change and grow? So programs at phase 3 might well need to go through phase 1 again to rebuild their infrastructure. So the sustainability wheel is when you bring the phases and facets together into one overall sustainability view. And hopefully, if we were in person, I'd have a pointer. You can see that the phases and facets are together. So instead of thinking our program is generally doing well, we're at a phase 2, you can break it down into this is where we are with governance, this is where we are with technology, resources, or engagement. So you might be at a phase 1 in governance and a phase 2 with technology. And I think it helps to break it down a little bit so you can focus on the areas where you need to grow the most. So this is where I'm going to hand it off to Megan, and she's going to get into much more depth about the details of the phases and facets.
Thanks, Laurie. As we just said, so I will talk a little bit about the characteristics of each phase. So if a program is wondering, what phase am I, in governance or in technology, this is sort of how you would decide what phase you are in. And then the objectives for moving forward, right? The goals of It Takes a Village is not just to identify where you are, but also help programs move forward along that path to sustainability. So we'll talk about what some of the objectives are that we recommend. So for governance, when we talk about phase 1, these are programs that are generally still working with their original software engineers, original project staff, funders, sponsoring organizations. The application might not even have end users yet, right? Leading to sort of this good faith over governance approach. Although it might be unclear what type of governance model a community wants or needs, making plans early in that life cycle can contribute positively to overall sustainability. Phase 2 governance can best be described as functional. Oh, no, sorry. Just back one, thanks. Phase 2 governance can best be described as functional, but limited in one or more aspects. So there might be documented policies and procedures for things like community contributions or technical oversight, but they're still probably going to exhibit that strong influence from program founders, from funders, specific staff members. So moving a program forward generally requires that succession planning to kind of break free from that founder influence. Then in phase 3, what we generally saw, so as Laurie mentioned, we thought we would see a lot more similarities among different projects. One thing that we did definitely see a similarity for with phase 3 programs is that they all had strong management structures, although they didn't all have formal governance. Many of these phase 3 projects are part of umbrella organizations that provide some of those structures that are needed to move things forward, things like marketing and communications or fiscal stewardship, grant writing, things like that. Phase 3 programs generally have tried and tested business models that help lead to more predictability and a better ability to plan ahead. So then moving on to the objectives for governance. So for phase 1, it's really defining a need for governance, right? What is the program trying to accomplish? So might be asking and answering questions like, where's your program having issues that something like a consensus policy could help mitigate? Or is there tension between, functional and technical teams? Then programs should select the governance model that works best for them at that moment. So in phase one, with the sort of staff and the plans that they have. And it can be helpful to sort of walk through common issues to test assumptions. Will this governance model help us, in these issues that we're having? We also always want to stress that all changes, so in this case, governance changes, should be communicated to stakeholders, right? If you want people engaged, you need to start at the very beginning. Objectives for phase two programs are to document and evaluate that existing governance. So making sure that those existing policies are documented, available for the community to access and use. Once programs have proper documentation, then everybody can evaluate, like, is this working? Programs should have confidence in deprioritizing, sunsetting, changing the scope of governance policies that aren't working, right? So not feeling, well, we set this policy up, so now we're locked into it forever. So it's really not uncommon for folks to outgrow certain things, and it's okay to do that. Lots of open source programs in phase two are exploring partnerships, engaging fiscal sponsors, looking for home organizations. So there's lots of growth and change happening here in phase two. In phase three, programs really do need then, here the growth and change element might be over, right? We're not teenagers anymore. And we want to look to programs that are supporting consistent structures, providing that trusted place for people. If I'm going to put my time and effort and money into this, I want to have confidence that it's going to keep going. To support program expansion, governance practices really need to evolve to then meet the needs of growing and changing communities. So continuing to engage in those regular evaluations of governance models as priorities, funding streams, and technologies shift. It's also really important for well-established programs to ensure that governance representation matches the makeup of the community and the key stakeholders. It's really easy to lean on the people who give the most money or the loudest voices, but that often can mean that the smaller folks are getting left out of those governance decisions. Moving on to technology. Thanks, Laurie. So phase one programs are in the really early stages of planning, design, and development. So the core goal from that technology perspective is to turn that great idea into a viable project that serves community needs. Phase one programs usually reside, somewhere between design and beta, but probably have either no users or a really small group of early adopters. Because phase one programs are generally writing most code from scratch, it can be really easy to suffer from technology and resource challenges, of course. Phase two is where we hope programs transition from grant funded or sort of niche project to sustainability. The core goal in this phase is to refine the application, strengthen areas that are working well, fill in areas that are lacking, and again, phase out things that just aren't clicking. Phase two programs have generally had more than one public release and have a formal release process that they follow. And the applications in use sort of beyond that founding sort of core beta testing group. And finally, phase three, the phase where things are going well, but programs need to focus on resilience and not fall into stagnation. So on the technology front, this means preparing for change. Applications might be nearing the end of their useful lives, and so program staff will need to look to the next generation of the application. Technology doesn't last forever, right? It's not a secret. So programs that are thinking about what to do next are really the most likely to be able to reinvent themselves rather than sunset. And then for those technology objectives, for phase one, returning to the community to understand core needs can help refine those priorities. Small, solid updates allow programs to focus on overall quality while showing those funders and potential implementers what's possible. Gathering information about community needs, right, shouldn't end when a project moves from design to development, should really be an ongoing process, training both program staff and community members how to successfully engage with one another. To move forward from phase two, again, it's always critical to engage that community. So only they can communicate what's working, what features and functionality are most heavily used, how can the application be improved. On the program side, right, growth always needs to be tempered with that support for existing code. So Programs that regularly telegraph the importance of documentation, of architecture, of infrastructure have a much easier time convincing their communities that it's important to spend time on those things and not just always be sort of chasing that next new feature. Phase 2 can also be a really good time to consider integration of renewed development. So moving forward or staying steady with phase 3, we'll say it 1,000 times, leads back to the community. If there are things that they need that the current platform can't support, it might be worth a look at a redesign or a re-architecture. If a need for a change is identified, then the planning can start, right? So working on a plan for evolution when things are stable rather than when it's a crisis allows for more thoughtful process. And then if you pay attention, the images we use usually do correspond to the point we're trying to get across. And so our last comment is on technology is that it's good to remember that sustainability is not synonymous with perpetuity. So it may be that a program was successful, but it has served its purpose and should be gracefully retired or sunsetted. On to resources, and I know we're sort of flying through this, right? Usually this is sort of a whole 2-day workshop process, so we're really just trying to give the highlight tour here. So our third facet is resources, and as we've mentioned, phase 1 programs are in the early stages of planning, design, and development. And so the core goal from a resources perspective is to create that consistent and sustained level of resources. In phase 1, programs usually don't have great plans for long-term support and are likely to be relying on a single program owner or champion or funder, right? So Helena touched on this a little bit in her talk. Most phase 1 programs are funded either wholly or in part by grants, which can mean that staff are term-based. Small program staff can also be really brittle, so the loss of one core person can have a really big impact. Again, phase 2 is going to be where programs transition from that grant funding to sustainability. So the core goal is diversification of both income stream and talent pools, right? So when we say resources, we don't mean just money, we also mean human resources. So programs in phase 2 have usually moved to some sort of diverse funding. They're no longer relying on a single income stream. They usually have a strong core team, but because that funding might still feel a little fragile, recruitment can sometimes be difficult, right? People don't necessarily want to accept term limited jobs that might not be there in a year or two. And then in phase 3, things are going well, but programs need to focus on resilience and not fall into stagnation. So the headline, stable but not static, sums it up very well. Hopefully the program has diverse staff and income streams, there's money available to maintain current infrastructure, and the loss of one income stream, shouldn't spell disaster. Objectives for resources to move forward. Phase 1 programs should look for people and resources that can help with things like business and financial sustainability planning. So understanding the market, what's the market that you're in, understanding your end users can really help determine what the best options are going to be for long-term financial sustainability. Maybe it's services and support, maybe it's membership, maybe it's a combination of lots of things. Within the business plan, we always stress that it's really critical to note what level of human resources are required to support each program element and to be really clear about what might be delayed or deferred as resources shift. Phase 2 programs to move forward, right? Always looking for ways to diversify those income streams, memberships, sponsorships, services, and support. And programs should work with their communities to decide which resonate. Vendors might have an important role to play in program sustainability as well. So it takes a village focused on programs that serve cultural and scientific heritage organizations. And those organizations don't always have technical expertise, often don't have technical expertise. So vendors can bridge that gap between the program and its users, improve community engagement, and bring in revenue. In phase 3, alliances and partnerships can contribute positively to that long-term sustainability. A skilled board or leadership group can also make a big difference in terms of a program's long-term success, right? They're often the group who can identify trends, determine how to mitigate the effects on a program's viability. So Todd, I thought that was great that you just brought up that Force 11, right? So here we have the board of Force 11 talking about it takes a village, right? They're the ones who should be thinking about this long-term sustainability plan. Phase 3 is also a time to be flexible in expectations about financial and in-kind contributions from organizations in developing economies, right? Hopefully our more regular income streams can allow us to calibrate financial requirements for some on something like a sliding scale so that we can expand that, representation and stakeholder pool. Last up, certainly not least, we have community engagement. Here, phase 1 programs are generally focused on their primary stakeholders, right? There's frequently a lack of engagement with the broader cultural and scientific heritage community, the broader OSS community, a lack of sort of an externally focused communication strategy. It might be from limited experience. It might be from a feeling that, outreach isn't a priority at this point. In this stage, though, the core stakeholders might still be developing their product strategy, right? Doing competitive environmental scans. Staffing is probably limited, might be dependent on one organization. So folks are really focused inward, right? Doing that core work as opposed to engaging with larger audience or trying to establish those communication practices. Phase 2 characteristics. This is when program participants are trying to figure out, okay, how do we best facilitate engagement that works for our community? At this stage, the community itself is probably small. They might be unsure of how to contribute, right? Maybe they want to contribute code, but the process isn't very clear. They want to help, they aren't sure how. They might wait until they're asked to contribute, right? You don't have this community that feels really empowered. Phase 3 programs tend to have that well-established infrastructure to enable participation. They provide a variety of opportunities to engage, conferences, user groups. They have representation from diverse geographic regions and different kinds of skill sets. So it's not just all technical contributions or technical community. They have sort of that vibrant end user and functional community as well. Moving forward with community engagement, so phase 1 programs should really just look to involve a wider group of stakeholders, right? So in order for the OSS to grow, the small group supporting it needs to grow as well. Forming something like an outreach committee, so making a commitment to do outreach means that community engagement and outreach isn't just a nice thing to do when people have time, but rather a commitment, that we are all putting our time and resources into. The communications and engagement strategy provides structure and not just about commuting out to people, but also start of that community engaging, with the application with one another. Phase 2 programs need to start setting up those processes, right? So if the characteristic of phase 3 is that it's all there, then that means phase 2 programs need to do the work to get it in order. And that's going to be really a focus on shifting people from interested, oh, okay, I'm curious about that, to engaged, how do I contribute to this? Eager to see, eager to participate, eager to contribute. Programs should really encourage spontaneous, informal, non-directed community activities, right? So shouldn't be this feeling that, oh, well, I can only do a conference presentation if I clear it with the program staff first, or, if I want to have a regional meetup, I should probably talk to them. Community should feel really empowered to do that without sort of explicit direction from the program staff. One thing program staff can do is consider creating things like toolkits or structures to facilitate, those kinds of activities that then people can take and run with on their own. Phase 3 programs should consider infrastructure and tools to enable further communication into new communities. And again, keep doing that work to ensure that there are mechanisms and processes to enable programs to help program participants to help each other. So at this phase, it's really this, situation of continuous evaluation and improvement to make sure that we're sort of pruning that engagement plan. Again, we're really supporting and trying to grow the things that are working, and then pruning those things that don't seem as effective or that haven't gotten as much take up. So all of this, so again, this is just a very wee bit of it. So all of this was published in the It Takes a Village Guidebook. So this was the core output of the original project that was funded by the IMLS. It's this guidebook that was designed to serve as a practical reference source to help OSS programs serving cultural and scientific heritage plan for long-term sustainability. Right, the whole goal here is that as long as people are relying on that software, as long as the software is usable, that we want to make sure it's also viable and sustainable. So the link is there on the slides, and you can download the guidebook for free, of course, and view all the things in there. And then we'll hand things back to Laurie, and she's going to talk about where we're going next.
Great, thanks, Megan. So as Megan mentioned, we published the guidebook. We were very excited. People gave us great feedback. And we'd say like, so was it helpful? And they say, yes, but how do we use it? And we'd be like, well, you read it and then you do the things we said would be helpful. And that's just not as helpful as we thought it would be. So we approached IMLS and they were very nice and funded another phase to really create and pilot an adaptable set of tools for practical use in planning and managing the sustainability. A lot of times people would come to us and like, can you help us? And we can, but consulting, but we really want to enable you guys to do this. So it's also intended to strengthen the ability of libraries, archives, and museums to sustain the community-supported programs that are critical. So we just got this funding this year. And so I wanted to give you a little bit of a sense of what we're doing. In this first year, it's like all workshops all the time, I feel like. So Megan and I are doing a series of 4 workshops, one for each, and we've changed the order of phases and facets, so it's throwing me a little bit. But so for example, for governance, if you're in phase 1 and you want to get to phase 2, in the guidebook, we have moving forward objectives. So defining a need for governance. You might be surprised at the different levels of governance that there are. Reviewing existing governance models, selecting the governance model that works best for them at that time, and communicating changes to stakeholders. So in these workshops, so the one for governance, we'd have different groups, and it's really focused around these activities. We're trying to build a toolkit or a toolbox, and so we originally talked in terms of tools, but there was a lot of confusion about what a tool was and if it was a piece of software. So an activity is just supposed to be that, something like a checklist, a discussion guide, a matrix. And so an example of one for governance that we've used it's a great one to use, is catastrophizing. So in this group, you would get together and brainstorm catastrophes that would have a significant impact on your program's ability to fulfill its mission. So for example, you have an amazing program director who wins the lottery and moves to Tahiti. What does that mean for your program? Are suddenly you're dead in the water because you don't know how to proceed or what to do? Or you're like, we actually have a co-director, we have a very engaged governance board, we're good, we don't need it, our structures are good. It's a nice activity that helps show whether your program needs more governance or if there are gaps. So for example, that activity we would have in these workshops, the participants discuss these things and say, is it useful? Would we keep it, alter it, or change it? Sometimes they'd say like, yep, this one is really helpful. Sometimes they'd say like, this one is really similar to one you already have, so maybe you don't need both. Or this one would be good if you made the output a little clearer. So Megan made this lovely chart that kind of conveys what we're doing for these 2.5 years. So for each of the I still do it wrong. Each facet, we have the workshop. So we've done for governance and technology so far, we've done the initial workshop where we invite practitioners to review the activities. Then we take all that feedback, edit, refine, create, and now we're in the beta testing with governance and about to go into beta testing with technology. After we have several programs for each doing beta testing. When they come back to us, they will hopefully give us more feedback and input into what could be improved, what could be better. Then once we're done with all of them, we'll pilot all 4 facets with 2 programs and then do one last iteration. We've been working with an instructional graphic designer and they're amazing. So by the end, in summer 2022, we will have all the tools available in a final form. I wanted to let you know that if you have questions in the future, we're happy to answer. There's our contact info. We also just created a listserv because people kept saying like, we'd like to know what's happening. So if you're interested in joining the very low traffic listserv, where we just give updates on an occasional basis, feel free to let us know. You can also check out the guidebook and more project info at lyrasis.org/ITAV. And we are happy to answer questions. I think we have a little time left in this session, and also in the future, we're happy to answer questions then as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you, Laurie. Thank you, Megan. So fascinating to listen to you guys talk about this as we're just starting out in the process. A quick question from my perspective, and then I have a couple others. I thought it was really fascinating in the last slide about the concept of what does beta testing a governance model look like? Like, I understand beta testing in a software environment. Like, oh, we have the software, we're going to see if it works. How do you beta test governance without like totally screwing things up badly?
It's a great question. And I tend to jump in to answer frequently. So I always want to give Megan an opportunity to speak first or, clarify what I'm saying.
Sure. No, I can take it. And so I think so what we're beta testing are the activities themselves. So not the governance model, but the activities that your group would use to figure out what your governance model is. So catastrophizing, for example. So that's an actual handout. You print it out, it's a PDF, you print it out, your team has it. You have a facilitator and you go through this exercise. You brainstorm the list of catastrophes. You talk about how your governance model, might manage it. And so that's really what we're looking for feedback on right now is this activity successful in helping you achieve the objective of figuring out the governance model that works for you? Were the instructions clear? How long did it take? Did you understand who was supposed to participate in this activity? So some of the activities do sort of ask you to beta test, what would a new governance model look like? Some of the activities do that. But when we talk about beta testing, it's really if you're a program and you're coming into It Takes a Village and you're hoping, we're at phase 2 in technology and we'd like to be a phase 3, is this group of activities going to help us achieve that objective or, understand what we need to do?
And we're also really testing the structure. Like we have activities for each objective. Do we have too many activities? Not enough. Is the output of that activity productive in moving you towards figuring out which governance model you need?
Mm-hmm. In your model, you've got governance, technology, community engagement. Based on your experience and your observations having worked with this model, which of those 4 tends to be the most problematic? Where do you see the most problems arising?
It's funny because I thought you were going to ask a totally different question. I thought you were going to say something that frequently comes up and that people were going to say like, these overlap. And I was going to, yes, they definitely overlap. They're not as bright, shiny divisions as we say. They all overlap.
Sure.
It's a good question. I think the reason to break them up is because they're all equally significant and they're kind of building blocks. We do them in the order that we do because governance isn't necessarily the most important, but you have to figure out how you're going to resolve those issues later. So governance is important because you need to figure out who figures out the problems. When there's an issue with technology, who figures it out? When there's an issue with resources, I think resources are the issue that can stop a program very quickly. But if you don't have engaged community, that means you don't have resources, which means you don't have money to build the technology. And so no one needs to make a decision. Like they all interlap. But Megan can argue with that perspective, of course.
Yeah, no, I think that I agree.
Is there one area where people are like run most quickly into roadblocks?
I think our community has a lot of experience with governance. And so I feel like that's their comfort zone. That's where they're like, okay, we can figure out how to have meetings and how to move along and how to make policies. And I think the resourcing, when you really have to figure out how do we financially have enough resources to either pay people or contract with people or get volunteers, I think it requires more business planning, which is not always a comfort zone of folks.
So I just went back. So in the guidebook, we actually have a photograph of the sticker vote that we did. So we had a forum in Baltimore and people put lots of facets up on the walls. And then we voted on what, we thought the top ones were. And so I was just curious. And I was like, I wonder if we wrote it down in there. So I'll tell you that the one that got the most votes at our initial forum was community engagement in terms of the people at that forum, which, is a cross section of people, but a group of 49 people. And so community engagement was the #1 vote getter in terms of what people thought was the most critical facet for us to discuss. And then it actually looks like it was a tie between governance, technology, and resources for the next level. And then the other things really kind of fell off. you know, and I'm looking actually, and like also in that number 2 was communications and outreach, which we ended up folding into community engagement. So it was actually number 1 twice when we had our initial thing. So that's another, you know, another data point for you.
And I think we actually have a picture of that dot
We do.
vote
I was going to say I could show.
in the
I don't think I
guidebook.
can show it because my weird my weird
Oh,
green screen. There you go.
green screen is making it disappear.
That's right.
All right. Well, for those of you who haven't taken a look at this, I strongly encourage you to explore the virtual workbook that exists about ITAV. Um, from what I've read about it, it seems like a really interesting model and one that I'm looking forward to exploring in a lot more detail in the next 6 weeks.
And we're eager to hear about your experience and what would be more helpful as you go forward.
Definitely.
Yeah, I mean, particularly because we're using it not as, we're kind of adapting it within Force. That is not a technology project. It's not an open source development project. So we're having to adapt it in certain ways. Sure, well, I'll be happy to provide some feedback to you.
But that is exactly what people have said, like it's designed for open source, but it's applicable to these other programs. So I think one of our future potential projects is figuring out how to make it more easily adapt to non-open source programs. So your feedback would be welcome.
Yeah, great.
Thanks.
And if anyone else is trying it out as well, let us know.
Yes.
All right. Well, Laurie, Megan, thank you so much.